please allow me to introduce you to Ted Childs, Childs LLC, former Chief Diversity Officer at IBM, and I believe the first person to hold that position.
Yes.
Joy Bunson, who is now a consultant with leadership culture and D&I consultant at JFB Consulting, and also was a former Chief Human Resources Officer at JP Chase. Also, please help me welcome May Snowden of Snowden Associates, who held the office of Chief Diversity Officer at Starbucks years ago.
Yes.
And Tanya Odom, Global Diversity and Inclusion and Education Consultant and Executive Coach, who also has been doing, I think, both coaching as well as development within DEI inside of philanthropy, and is also sought out for her wellness expertise and coaching around health, well-being, and wellness. So please welcome our panelists.
We should be clapping for each other.
So this panel came about, and I bullied the staff into allowing me to do it, because there were a number of things that I was seeing in my experiences with chief diversity officers, with DEI practitioners, around just the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What was falling underneath that umbrella, what was not inside that umbrella, the expectations that both staff and senior executives had about what people should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, what it's called, et cetera. And Dr. Weiner did a really great job, and the last panel did a really great job of kind of laying out what some of the dynamics have been around diversity, equity, and inclusion, how it's thought about. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper because we're at a particular point where if we don't ground ourselves somewhere, we won't be able to stand our ground. And we're kind of like weeds in the wind when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. People challenge us, they challenge the work that we're doing, they challenge the importance or the relevance of it, and we don't always have our feet firmly grounded to be able to say, that's not what DEI is. Let me help you understand what it is and how we got to where we are. So that's how this session got generated. I also like to share this as an example to just give some context. On my birth certificate, my race says Negro. I was born in 1964, and the racial category on my birth certificate says Negro. Over the course of my life, I have been Negro, I have been Afro-American, I've been Black, I've been African-American, and there'll likely be something else before they throw dirt on my face. That's a little something that we call evolution and evolutionary thinking. And so I think it's important for all of us to be deeply grounded in the history of diversity, equity, and inclusion so that when the naysayers come, you don't have to rely on good feelings, but you can actually rely on some facts and examples. So, with that said, Ted, I'd like to start with you, and all of the questions are going to be open to all of the panelists, but I'm going to ask each person to start off, and if you have something that you'd like to add to it, that's great. So Ted, I want to start with you in your journey of what we now call DEI. That began for you in the 1970s at IBM.
1967.
1967. I stand corrected, 1967. And so at that time, the efforts were more known or seemed to be more under the umbrella of equal opportunity. And I guess what I'd like to start is, could you just share what were one or two of the concerns that the company had that they hoped to be addressed by efforts around equal opportunity? So remember, this is before the D, before the E, before the I, before the B. This is equal opportunity 1967. So what were one or two of the concerns that the company had that they were hoping that equal opportunity would address?
Well, okay, now you sent me something to think about.
Yes.
So I'm going to answer your question in the context, the historical context.
Perfect.
I'll be 80 this year. Grew up in Massachusetts, parents both from the Deep South. Went to one of the colleges that was one of the first colleges to reverse integrate as a result of the Brown decision saying that white students could now go to colleges that were previously only for black. As I have thought about this journey, I talk often about 3 events that took place in the first 10 years of my life that I think fashioned the civil rights journey of my life. The first was April 15th, 47, Jackie integrated baseball. The second was July 26, 48, Truman's executive order integrating the military, and then May 17th, 54, the Brown decision. Now we took 3 key elements of our society, America's pastime, baseball, the military, and the schools, and we said it was okay to have peer relationships with black and white in those 3 places, because before that we didn't have peer relationships. The workplace came after that, but along that journey we also had 5 assassinations in the United States. Bobby, Jack, Martin, Malcolm, and Medgar. This thing called equal opportunity was imposed upon us. And I think we would have gotten there, but what was going on in our society made it necessary. So the answer to your question is, in the 60s, there were only 2 groups, black and women. I say 2, not in terms of existence, but in terms of workplace challenge. Because both of them, one wanted to be employed, the other wanted to be able to do something besides sit behind a typewriter. Aspiration was there for both. Civil Rights Act of 64. In 1970, I was in the first group of HR people that had to deal with the legislative equal opportunity issue. And it was order number 4. The Labor Department had responsibility for 11246. And order number 4 was the first authorization to audit companies, where we had to deal with the Labor Department and they'd come knock on the door, and when they knocked on the door, it was, "May I welcome you?" It was very polite. We did not know what to expect. We did know that if we screwed up, there was a risk, because the only people being audited were government contractors. And what they held over your head was that if they found you guilty of bad behavior, you could be barred from doing business with the government. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So there was a lot in that, and we're going to go back into some of that. So Joy, you led one of the largest human resources functions in the world.
At least on the development side.
Yes, yes. So while you were at JP Morgan Chase, you actually were the person who began developing and executing what became known as the diversity strategy at JP Morgan Chase. And so, and as I understand it, many of the people who worked for you are now chief diversity officers themselves. So I'd like to know, if we kind of continue on this timeline, where do you enter? What year is it? Is there a word called diversity at that time, or what are we structurally moving through? And what were you thinking about to both articulate and be able to execute this progression from equal opportunity to what became known as diversity?
Well, not to throw a monkey wrench in this,
Sure.
but I entered the what is now DEI field about the time that the word D became known, not well known, but not from that context. I entered it from the context of what we used to call balancing work and family. Remember that? In the olden days when people had like those images of jugglers, right? And I think, Ted, to your point, the issues of gender equity and the issues of racism were the two issues anybody talked about in the workplace. But we entered, and I'm delighted to see some of my old team members sitting here in the room, and I know some others are online, but we entered in terms of work-family, now work-life, or whatever it is you call in your companies, work-life integration. And our journey was really catalyzed by a change. At JP Morgan Chase, this was actually way before JP Morgan, this was way before chemical. I call this like vintage Chase. Vintage Chase, we were primarily located, at least in New York, on Wall Street. Obviously there were branches all over the place, but you know, our headquarters was on Wall Street. Some of you know that, Chase Manhattan Plaza. Now the site of like a great restaurant, Manhattan, and what used to be our executive dining room. Now imagine we had an executive dining room on the top floor, the 60th floor. But we were enticed by the city of New York at that point in time to move about 6,000 employees, primarily from downtown Manhattan, from Wall Street, to downtown Brooklyn. And it was part of an urban redevelopment project that the city of New York was offering as opportunities for companies. Today we would be really clear and say this was gentrification. Back then, it was tax cuts in the city of New York, making it really easy for companies like Chase to move into new neighborhoods. That was for the leadership who came to work at cars and who really didn't have to worry about getting to work. And what became very clear as we were planning for this move was the trepidation that employees had about making such a significant change, right? Because up until this time, any of you who worked in banking back in the, let's say, late 80s, early 90s, extraordinarily hierarchical institution in banking. We had not been democratized at all the way that manufacturing had been. We looked to colleagues like Ted at IBM as total pioneers. We were barely asking our employees a question about how they felt at work. And I remember my very first year of working, we asked the question, we didn't like the answer, we never told anybody. We threw that survey away. Nobody talked about it, nobody communicated about it. So that's the context, right? So now we're moving all these people to Brooklyn, to downtown Brooklyn. Brooklyn was not the super cool place it is now, for those of you who are from New York City or who have kids who are just desperate to live in Brooklyn, right? That was not the case at that point in time. Wall Street was the place that people in finance wanted to work. So we were asking people to move, to make this significant change in their lives, and honestly, they just did not want to go. Not for money, not for anything, they just didn't want to go. So our leadership said, oh God, now maybe we should just ask them, what's it going to take for them to go? Because we're getting offered all this money to move, but we don't want to build this really gorgeous building and have it be empty. And that was actually the catalyst at JP Morgan Chase, then Chase, to start to embark on a series of workplace initiatives that started with work family and eventually grew into diversity, that at their core were about giving employees a voice and asking employees what it would take for them to be as productive and effective at work as they could be. Now we started on the work family side because that was actually what people articulated at that point in time to us the most. They were complaining about their commutes. They were complaining about the additional cost to get to downtown Brooklyn from downtown Manhattan. So we started to ask them. What we found out was, irrespective of the move, right, they were suffering in terms of lack of flexibility, in terms of lack of childcare options, in terms of resources to support their elderly parents. So this is the Brooklyn building, which is Metrotech, and some of you may be familiar with it, opened in 1992. This is about 1988 that we are asking people these questions. And we were super lucky as an HR function that when we asked the questions, our leadership was motivated to actually incorporate employees' opinions and thoughts into the answers. So we actually opened the first large corporate backup child care center in the world at Metrotech when that building opened, because people were really concerned about not their everyday child care. They were taking too many different forms of transportation to get to work, but they were concerned like, what if? What if school's closed? What if my mother, who normally takes care of my baby, has a doctor's appointment? Like, what am I going to do about that? And there had been like one small child care room in a law firm that we knew about, but aside from that, we had the opportunity to start that at JP Morgan Chase, and again, some of my colleagues are here, by way of talking to people, finding out what their most pressing needs were, and then we actually were able to institutionalize that into the physical plant of the building that we built. So the executive dining room that was on the 60th floor of Chase Manhattan Plaza, and the gym that was only accessible to vice presidents and above, well, at Metrotech, we didn't have an executive dining room, and our gym was accessible to anybody by lottery who wanted it. And that was in part driven by the fact that the gym was too big for the few vice presidents that were there, right? Practicality. But also, it gave us the opportunity to start to create more of a democracy at work, and that's what actually created our initial diversity efforts.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joy. So May, early in the field's journey, you were the Chief Diversity Officer at Starbucks. And I imagine that function may have been relatively new, but the thing that I'm most interested in is you wrote what I believe to be one of the seminal articles about employee resource groups and their history and how they came to be. And I know that we're having a panel on employee resource groups, but as a part of this emergence of diversity, equity, and inclusion, could you just talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of that emergence, whether it's through employee resource groups or the roles that you've held of what we now call diversity, equity, and/or inclusion?
All right, thank you. That's a big question, isn't it? Oh my goodness.
I only ask it because I know you can answer.
All right, okay, very good, okay. All right, I had a solid career in telecommunications. So AT&T owned all the Bell systems at that particular time, you remember that. And I had a great career and did a lot of different things. But one of the things that was quite interesting to me was that we had a huge complaint, and it basically came from the women. It was related to pay equity and some other things, promotions and so forth. And we're a government contractor. And so what happened was that we actually had something we had to do. And this is some of the things that I find that people aren't very active in the doing. We're active in the saying. We're active in the promoting internally and externally, but we're not active in the doing. We had to do. So it was one of the things that happened from that was we did focus in on affirmative action, which was good. I learned affirmative action. I learned what equity is about. I learned about doing assessments, and I think that we have lost that today. I find so many diversity strategies are not based on any assessment, and I don't see any metrics that says, oh, okay, this is where we want to be, but this is where we are now, we got a gap here, then we got to close it. So with affirmative action, I saw that we were able to select some milestones, some goals, and start working towards closing those. So I learned from that because that was the basics of what I was trained on in operations. So as we have developed and gone on through different ways and doings in DE&I, and by the way, after affirmative action and equal opportunity, we called it pluralism. We didn't call it diversity. It was pluralism before it became diversity from the AT&T days and the operating companies. So it's quite interesting, our stories. We keep changing the names and adding to it, but we gotta keep focusing in on what is it that we wanna do. And the values of the company, the guiding principles are so key, and if we would focus in on that, then we would know what it is that we need to do related to the diversity, inclusion, and equity, because we are basically following our values and guiding principles and our vision and our mission. So that's one of the things I found. Now, when I got to Starbucks, after going from telecommunications, then manufacturing, because I also had a stint at Kodak, which was really a great experience for me. Where at Kodak at the particular time, we had nooses being put up in some of the areas, and KKK written on the lockers of our employees. And so it was tough work that had to address those kinds of things. But when I got to Starbucks, what a unique opportunity this is. Here I have had basically all of my experience in organizations where the generation is made of baby boomers, those folks that are over 45 basically. And now you get to Starbucks and it's made up of folks that are around 18 to 22. That's the predominant group, the partners. So it was a total different thing that I had to learn because we're all in learning. So what I learned there was how to really focus in on the generations, what the generations desire, how it is that they want to communicate, how it is that they want to advance, what kinds of things are important to them in their personal lives as well as their business lives. So those were really important and things that I really did learn. But the basic thing that I learned in all of my experiences is that when you're leading DE&I, it comes to your personal experience. And the thing that has to be done first is a change within. So until I was able to really focus in on what it is that I needed to change to include more diversity within my own life and experience, what I needed to change to be more inclusive in my behaviors, what I needed to change to be more equitable, I could not lead DE&I. And that is something that I really do focus in on when I'm coaching, when I'm consulting, is that it begins with the individual. It's a behavior change that we're requiring, and we can come up with all kinds of strategies. We can do all kinds of things related to training and ERGs and so forth, but it has to be a change within. Now in the telecommunication companies, we were kind of the second group to have ERGs. It started at Xerox because there was a big race issue going on in Rochester, New York. But then the AT&T Bell companies took it on because we had issues. We had employees that wanted ERGs, and they started in homes. I remember being part of the first ERG, and we met at people's homes. We met at our church. We met at any place that we could meet. We did not meet at the organization to form the ERG. The women were doing the same thing. So we had a black ERG and a woman's ERG forming around the same time. And that's the way we formed it before we went to the leadership to talk about it. Now, my issue with ERGs is that it is great in helping people find an area where they feel that they belong because they belong there. You know, they've grown up there. They feel comfortable, right? We like to feel comfortable. We don't want to feel uncomfortable. So we have gotten to that part with our ERGs, but now it's time for our ERGs to be uncomfortable. It's time for our ERGs to learn about the other groups and to be inclusive. Just because you're in a women's ERG or a black ERG, that does not mean you know and understand the inclusive behaviors that are required. And so I'm really focused in on trying to get even more evolution, more movement. We've been moving from just focused in on ourselves to focused in on the business strategy, but now we need to be focused in on inclusive behaviors so that even with religion, we are learning about all the world's religions. We are all connected. And yet we're fighting.
Thank you, May. So y'all can see I've got 15 minutes left. Okay. Tanya, I want to come to you. So you've been working squarely in diversity, equity, and inclusion on a global scale, also at the time when belonging got added in. And there'll probably be some other words that come down the pipe. I'd love for you to talk about what you've seen as the evolution of what people understand DEI to be from the beginning of when you started doing this work to what you see now. And if you could throw in a little bit about how people understand the relationship between DEI and civil and/or human rights.
Sure. So I just have to say, especially because we only have a couple of minutes, for those of you who don't know the three people on this panel, just as someone who's been in this space for over 25 years, I would strongly suggest you Google them, because I am here in my place and I've been able to do this work because of the three of them. So I just want to put that out there. Seriously, I'm very serious. So when Mark asked me to do this panel, I was like, come on, Mark, like, you know. So I even stepped backstage, just put me at the end. Like, come on now, like, you're gonna put me over here. So let me just say this. So I entered the space from a not-for-profit background. I was really fortunate in the late 90s, in the early 90s, to have a dean at college who literally said, and this has been written about, you need to get paid for that mouth, right? He connected me to a civil rights organization where Mark and I first met. That was actually a Jewish-focused civil rights organization, but that focused on anti-Semitism and issues of bigotry overall. So that was my sort of foray into the professional side of this. And I say that because even the language of anti-bias, so just figure this was about 1993, that was sort of in the education sector and on the education side. Fast forward through the 90s, I was doing this work mostly in schools in the not-for-profit world. It was diversity, period, end stop. This E, I, B, J, A, you know, and I'm not putting down justice or accessibility, I'm just saying that it didn't exist. And the goal was compliance. The goal was, we know that our organizations, I mean, you know, you heard this phenomenal panel before, and Dr. Wiener, as Mark said, really gave a lot of the background, and I'm happy if you all want to ping me. I've gone down rabbit holes in the last a year or so, actually I should say since George Floyd's murder, because there was this vacuous space where we have all these people who suddenly became experts, giving incorrect facts. So the fact that Tanenbaum has this panel of people who created these policies and practices versus someone who like writes this long thing on LinkedIn and then says, hire me as a consultant. Okay, won't go there. But the point is, I think there was this evolution, right? And so the diversity and inclusion we started to see, particularly as we started to see global work. Joy and I met for lunch the other day, and it's interesting because both May and Joy were my clients when I worked as a consultant with Margaret Regan at Towers Perrin. So I was all over the world for Chase doing focus groups. And Joy and I were talking about this the other day, that it was diversity. Like, we would be speaking in Spanish, and then we would say diversity, right? But it became this sort of bigger picture of inclusion, because then we were talking about what diversity looked like in different countries around the world. And so that started to evolve. And by the way, and I want to just say this about religion, in that both September 11th, for those of us that were doing the work in the private sector in particular, created a very, very, very pivotal point to be talking about religion and that inclusion part. And that was all the research you just saw from this previous panel. I think and the other piece I want to say around religion is that I was doing focus groups in London for a financial services company that was that had a new prayer room, and wanted to know how the different religious groups were going to share the space, and that was in the late 90s. So one of the hard things for me is to see these sort of, quote, experts or people speaking that talk about how this is new. It's evolved, but some of these issues, if you ask these three people on the stage, they've dealt with every single one of the things that have come up right now. So then the belonging piece, I think people thought, well, we have the inclusion piece. Let's look at DIB. And by the way, I'm going to get to equity in a second, because I would strongly push most companies to really think about if they truly had equity in terms of their policies, practices, and mindset. But the belonging piece was sort of like, okay, we're saying we're including people, but does that mean they belong? Does that mean they have a voice? I think the one thing I will say, and Ted, I think I told you this many times, but the other thing I want to say is someone who recently went in-house internally in a company in a foundation after being external for many years, is that all of your roles are so key and different for people that are external. That I was a consultant for a very long time, and I'm back in that role again, and very fortunate to do that, but it's very different to be internal. And so each one of these people, I can tell you, literally had pivotal points where they had to push all the D, I, and B. So this is the last thing I'll say on this, and how people understand it. I think people are still trying to understand the importance of the D. I think the inclusion and belonging, and May, you work with a lot of chief diversity officers, but the B part for some people, they're not there yet. I think we see some research from Culture Amp, we've seen some research from other places about belonging, but we see people not there yet. But when you want to talk about people doing this work with this change, I was working for a large global advertising company as a consultant, and half of my session were leaders and they weren't in the room. And I was like, I can't start. And they were like, well, they're upstairs with Ted Childs. And I was like, oh, and they were like, it's not a good meeting. And I was like, you know, what happened? And they were like, well, Ted said he's not giving us any business unless we fix the problem. And I was like, where are my people? Like, and so then they came down and Ted, I don't know what you did, but like they came down and it was this notion of there was no change. There wasn't the opportunity not to change. And I think this is what I heard in the last panel. I love this language of collective sense making. How do we make sense of the current moment? Ted started us out with that sort of history and timeline, which by the way, there are some really good ones out there. I'd say Washington Post had a phenomenal one in March of 2024. Department of Labor has a really good one. EEOC website has great timelines. But I think we have to look at what the present moment is asking us to do versus what we've always done before. I also think, and the last thing I'll say is, I think we have to be really careful at this being trendy. And I think since George Floyd's murder, there's been some things that a lot of us have seen and called each other about that are really concerning. And I would rather us default to the three people on this stage, plus Tanenbaum, of course, than someone who has a glitzy website. That's what I'll end by saying.
I guess that means you've looked at our website?
That's why I asked her to come. So with the time that we have left, I just want to ask this last question. There is the whole idea of, those who don't know their history are bound to repeat it. So what would you say, each of you, we've got 6 minutes, what would each of you say is the critical reason to be mindful of the history of diversity, equity, and inclusion, given the work that we're having to do today? What's the critical, why is it not negotiable? Why is it something that everyone, not just in this room, but anyone that has a DEI BJA attached to their title and name must do this work?
The key word is difference. Back in the 60s, today, what we're confronted with is difference. Don't get immersed in a focus on or the pursuit of metrics unless the metrics relate to your culture and how it makes your workplace better.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm looking at the damn clock.
You're looking at the 5 minutes?
Okay.
Give me one more.
Momentary victories, permanent vigilance. There's nothing guaranteed. Nothing. Ask the women who are looking at Roe. Ask the GLBT community looking at, they're coming after their marriage rights. It's for the moment. We changed we brought diversity into the deal in 1991, and it was a fight. The Equal Opportunity Department was established in 1967, 6 months after I joined the company, and the first black executive was hired from the Kennedy administration to head it. It was Director of Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action. When it went on the bulletin board, I told my manager, I want that job one day. 24 years later, I got that job. And 30 days later, I went to the senior vice president and said, I want to change the title. I need buy-in from white guys, and this equal opportunity affirmative action bullshit offends them. I'm not going to get any partners in that community. He said, you can't change the name. They'll think that him being the senior VP and the chairman, have turned our backs on affirmative action. He said, you wait 6 months, do whatever you want. First group to approach me was the gay community. Second group to approach me was a group of black managers saying, Ted, we're with you on everything you want to do, but we're not into this gay thing. And I explained to them, do you know what jumping over the broom was? He said, yeah, us getting married, a celebration. I said, yeah, you jumped over a broom because you couldn't go to City Hall and get a marriage license. These people just want to be treated like you. Look for metrics that will change your culture and make it a better place to accomplish two things. Get talent and sell your product, whatever it is.
I'll take that, thank you. Joy, May, Tanya.
So I would say, and this is a counterpoint, but maybe the same point that Ted's making, look for commonality. At a moment when people are so fractured, where our differences, which we're in this field, right? We all value differences, we appreciate differences, we're curious about differences. But what are our common elements? And I go back to what I learned by introducing diversity actually by accident at JP Morgan Chase through the lens of work and family, was that everybody had people in their lives that they cared about, that everybody wanted to be in a place where they could be cared for as individuals and where they could care for others. And to the extent that we were able to create an environment where people could speak up and speak out. So my second point would be about activism, but I don't think I have time for that. But when we could get to that point where people could say, hey, I need your help in making me and my family everything we can be, no matter what our differences were. That was something that united us and something that gave us something to fall back on, even when all the other work was hard. Even when people didn't want to talk about race, even when people didn't want to talk about LGBTQ plus differences, not that we actually talked about much of those then either, or when disability, ability were not even in our lingo. That was something we could fall back on. And I think today, with so much noise, that going back to who you care for and how you care for yourself, May's point, is really critical to make progress.
May.
One of the things that I think is really critical when we're thinking about where we are today, as well as looking back into history, is to understand that obstacles do not block the path. Obstacles are the path. That's a Zen proverb that I really like it because it keeps me going. There's always going to be obstacles. There's always going to be resistance. It has been from the beginning of the world. So just know that, right? Know that. Now, one of the things that I have learned through the years is how important leadership or stakeholder involvement is. And oftentimes we don't want to spend the time to get that done. It takes time. It takes time. But if you don't, you do not have the support that you need. I speak with a lot of people, a lot of CDOs, a lot of organizations that don't have support for their DE&I strategy because they haven't taken the time to seek the stakeholders and the leadership and get them involved and get them trained. They need to understand what organizational change is, what they need to do to accomplish organizational change. They need to understand their biases, start working through their biases. There's so many things that they need to be able to communicate. But if we don't spend the time with them to help them get ready to do that, how are we going to be successful? So as you look over the past, be sure you focus in on stakeholder involvement, leadership involvement. Communications is key too, but I'll leave my time for if there's.
Yeah, thank you, May. No, not at all.
much.
No, you did not. I would say this, I think that we don't have a good awareness of history of both the civil rights movement, definitively. I've spent time in Selma and Montgomery. I've watched more documentaries than are known to humankind. I participated in a commemorative march on the 50th anniversary of Selma to Montgomery. We don't have that knowledge. Many of our diversity leaders don't have that knowledge. And we've romanticized that. And I don't think we realize, if you watch some of these documentaries, Dr. King developed a twitch at one point in his life, right? And if you watch one of the documentaries, Harry Belafonte talks about this twitch that he developed because he was so used to having to be on alert. The other thing I think about is the research on weathering that many people are finally embracing, which talks about how our body weathers. And I think about those of us who do this work. And the example that Dr. Geronimus gives is of Dr. King, and of Dr. King being in his 30s when he was assassinated. But in fact, the autopsy showed that he had a body of a 60-something-year-old. So I think if we don't think about that, we're not thinking about what well-being in our organizations mean. We're not thinking about the current political climate and the polarization. We're not thinking about how diversity has always been demonized, whether it was called equal opportunity or civil rights or LGBTQ rights. We haven't brought up people with disabilities, and I just want to talk about that, and the ADA being one of those pieces that also comes up. That brings up these things. Last thing I'll say that I think is really important that I know we will talk about, but to really understand, is the importance of thinking about these things from an intersectional approach. And I think we've all said this in some way. If I'm only thinking about myself as a biracial Gen Xer, I've missed a whole bunch of pieces of myself and my connection to other people.
Please help me thank Ted, Joy,